So number one, I just got to say that, look, a downtrend is defined by lower highs and lower lows. And that's exactly what we're experiencing right now. And whenever you're in a downtrend, you're likely to continue downtrending. So unless we see tangible signs of reversal defined by micro higher highs and micro higher lows, then there's always the bias for further downside. So just understand that that is the case short term. But also parallel understanding with the first quarter of other layer one smart contracts being out, they had their major dump, and that was the cycle all-time low. So therefore, probably makes sense to view these dips as opportunity rather than something to just like panic over. But with that being said, in terms of when is the 10,000x, when is the trillion-x, when are we going all to nirvana? In order to answer that question, we have to do something that I think a lot of people, I could be wrong about this, but my intuition tells me that a lot of people don't want to do, which is look at Bitcoin. Because in my opinion, man, to understand PulseChain, to understand PulseX, understand Hex, and when might be an optimal or less optimal time to take profits, the most important thing you could do is understand Bitcoin and look at the Bitcoin chart. And I know to a lot of people, this is blasphemy, burn the heretic. I get it, but just hear me out for a second. Right. Unfortunately, this boomer coin has been historically the largest driving factor that leads the market. It begins the bull market. It's typically the first thing to put in a new cycle all-time high. It's typically the first thing to reach a cycle all-time high. So it pumps before the altcoins and it reaches its all-time high typically a month or so, sometimes more, before the altcoins. And for those who like to say that, hey, we're a different ecosystem, we're not on dexes, blah 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 blah, we're not correlated. We are correlated due to the macro market sentiment. The sentiment matters tremendously. If Bitcoin is crashing and burning, it lowers the amount of potential buy pressure in the market. It disincentivizes people from investing further, looking into different opportunities. The sentiment 100% affects our ecosystem. Right now, we're looking at a chart which is the largest driving influence of market sentiment, and sentiment matters. Okay, so understand historically we operate on a boom and bust cycles. We exist in and we oscillate between extremes. Those extremes get kicked off by the Bitcoin halving every 4 years when Bitcoin being introduced in the market gets cut in half. Okay. So we understand this. Now, what we can see is that from the first Bitcoin halving to the first cycle top, it was 363 days, just about a year. Second time around, it was 531 days. This last cycle, it was 546 days. So what we see here is some indication of a lengthening cycle. What we can also see is that around the year mark, things start to look pretty toppy. So from about a year to a year and a half, things start to look kind of toppy with Bitcoin. Some argument for lengthening cycles. Okay, let's extrapolate that knowledge to the next cycle, because if we can understand the signals to look out for when Bitcoin starts to show signs of weakness come next cycle, folks, what that is that it serves as an early warning signal to start to think about taking profits, because historically the altcoins have reached their all-time high sometime after Bitcoin. While this is not guaranteed to happen, there's a strong likelihood that we're likely to not move in the same way, but rhyme in a similar way as we have in the past. And so understanding Bitcoin is tremendously important. So timing analysis, come kind of November 2025, if we shorten this to about a year, March 2025, within that window, sometime kind of mid 2025, there's some argument for Bitcoin looking kind of toppy, right? So I would argue that around that time, that's when we're probably going to see these crazy blow off top, euphoric, parabolic charts. That is what's necessary in order to attempt to realize some of these crazy 100x, 1000x, 10,000x gains. So something you got to understand, folks, is that sure, while a log chart is great for certain things, it is not useful for other things. In fact, the majority of price appreciation, we got to understand, comes at the very, very, very end of the cycle. And if you miss out, a month period, a quarter period, hell, a week period, you actually can miss out on the majority of the gains that a market has to offer. And so, guys, we are essentially, in my opinion, extremely, extremely blessed to operate in a kind of market that has this repeatable 4-year events, that kickstarts a bull market, that leads to Bitcoin having a parabola, where it tops off typically before everything else, thus giving us an early warning indicator. Now, I've mentioned this before. I'll try my best to briefly mention it this time. Let's try a little bit harder here to specifically identify a marker that we can look out for, that we can apply next cycle to have a concrete understanding of when Bitcoin's bull market might have ended. And this is useful because Bitcoin's an early warning signal. So if we can understand this concrete indicator and understand that if we see this next cycle, it is probably highly likely to be a good early warning indicator that the market is looking kind of toppy and you might want to think about taking profits. So essentially these markets are defined by euphoria, defined by a parabola, where we're putting in higher and higher highs. And what you need to do is understand when the parabola shape has broken. And when the parabola shape has broken, that is a very good signal that the bull market has come to an end. Does not guarantee it. As we can see this last cycle, we actually went on to put in a new all-time high. But what breaking the parabola does tell us is that being a bull further on later in the market continues to be more and more and more risky. It greatly increases the risk, right? Okay, so what can we do to try to understand when a parabola has come to an end? One thing you can do is find a support level that holds as support throughout the length of the parabola, that hugs the parabola, that gets tested as support at least once throughout the bull market, thus identifying that particular support level as relevant. And then if we continue the parabola, come back down and test it, hold the support, great. Continue it, come back and test it, and it fails, we get several daily candles opening, closing below it. That essentially, folks, marks the end of the parabola. At that point, the risk of being a bull, the risk of being a participant, holding and being long, greatly increases. We never sustainably put in new all-time highs after breaking the parabolic shape. So the 50-day simple moving average last cycle did an extremely good job. Pump, dump, hold a support, solidifying this moving average as relevant. Pump, dump, hold a support, solidifying this moving average as relevant even further. Pump, dump, we test, it fails, daily candles opening and closing, boom, bear market, beginning of bear market, death. Looking in 2017, same thing. Pump, dump, test it, hold a support. Pump, dump, test it, hold a support. Hold a support. It fails, several daily candles opening, closing, below it, death, bear market. Okay? So, guys, what we've done here is we've identified a concrete marker that helps us understand when the parabolic shape has ended, and therefore at what point the risk greatly increases, and therefore when it might make sense to take profits. If you pair this understanding with the fact that Bitcoin historically has reached cycle all-time high a month, sometimes more, before the altcoins, what we have here is a great early warning indicator. And maybe next cycle, it's not the 50-day SMA. Maybe it's a 55-day SMA. Maybe it's an EMA. Maybe it's a cloud, a band. There's many different ways of calling support. But what we're doing here essentially is identifying a support level that hugs the parabola, that gets tested at least once throughout the bull market, thus solidifying it as relevant. And then if we continue the parabola, we test it, and at one point it fails, that's your indicator. And early warning signal. And plus, I'm going to do you guys even more of a solid here. We can apply this exact same logic here with Hex. And probably come next cycle, also with PulseChain and PulseX, where if we understand the Bitcoin reaches all-time high before the altcoins, and if we apply the same kind of indicator to our favorite altcoin, and then you see this signal to your favorite altcoin come next cycle, then that's essentially a late warning signal. So we have an early warning signal and a late warning signal. We have a window of time in which it probably makes sense to think about taking profit. So let's take off the log chart for a second here. So this is Hex. It's first cycle here. We're pumping, we're dumping, boom, hold the support. We're pumping, we're dumping, we test it, It fails, several daily candles opening and closing below it. Bear market, crash, death. Now, you see this white line here? This was Bitcoin's first kind of all-time high. It wasn't really an all-time high because really it was 69K. So this peak right here at about $65,000, that's this white line here. And so what we see with Bitcoin is that, sometime after this peak, we came back down and tested the 50-day SMA and it failed, right? So around these regions, we got that early warning signal. So we can see that Hex actually was extremely parabolic afterwards. So I'm not arguing for like selling right away. I think it makes sense to DCA in, DCA out, blah, 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 blah. I'm not giving right here. What I'm trying to do here is not describe a completely, utterly perfect strategy. What I am attempting to describe here is a useful strategy. So let me continue to kind of spell this out here, right? And this second double peak right here at 69K was kind of over here. So, but if we kind of extrapolate this logic onto kind of PulseChain or PulseX next cycle, right? Come sometime late 2025, if we see Bitcoin, holding the 50-day SMA during the parabola, and then it fails, probably somewhere, over here, and then PulseChain continues to pump. I know for myself, moving forward, I'll probably start taking profits every pump we see. And I know that on my favorite altcoin, when I see it kind of fail the 50-day SMA or similar moving average, that's my late warning indicator. So in an attempt to summarize here, Bitcoin leads the market. It's extremely important to understand the influence that Bitcoin has on the market. It's important to understand what specific concrete markers you can look out for to know when a parabolic shape is ending, and thus, therefore, when it might make sense to take profits. If we know that Bitcoin takes profits historically, reaches all-time high historically before the altcoins, we understand that once we see that signal with Bitcoin, early warning signal, and then once we see that signal with our favorite altcoin, late warning signal, that's giving us a reasonable window of time in which you can have the best chance of realizing whatever gains the market has to give you, whether it's 100x, 1000x, 10,000x. I do believe that this kind of thinking is the most accurate way one has a chance of realizing these kind of euphoric gains. Let me know if that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, and just a quick question before we wrap up here too is: have you seen any indicators one way or another for the current times? Are you still looking for something to flash and tell you that we're headed towards bull?
Oh, in terms of bull, man, again, if we look at these markets, Bitcoin influences everything, and really, we just got to wait until the next Bitcoin halving. Like if we look at all the previous cycles, once the Bitcoin halving comes, that's where we start to see macro higher highs and higher lows. Because if we kind of take a moment here to take a look at the quote unquote bear markets and what constitutes a bear market. A bear market is ultimately defined by macro lower highs and lower lows. Like here, a lower high, lower lows, lower highs, lower lows, just everywhere we look. Before the Bitcoin halving is where we see those lower highs and lower lows. But what happens after the Bitcoin halving? Historically, we could see after each Bitcoin halving, it's just higher highs and higher lows. Higher highs, higher lows, higher highs, higher lows, everywhere we see after the latest Bitcoin halving. So essentially, right now, the next Bitcoin halving is March 2024. All this stuff here is really just noise. It doesn't matter if the shape ends up looking something like this, something like this, or something like this. What matters is that the bear market before the latest Bitcoin halving has always historically been defined as macro lower highs and lower lows. So does it really matter exactly the shape of those macro lower highs and lower lows? No, it doesn't. What matters is this thing right here, because historically, after we experience this thing, it's macro higher highs and higher lows. And depending on the economic situation of the day with Bitcoin, the stock market, quantitative easing, tightening, that will define exactly what those higher highs and higher lows look like. But ultimately, everything before the latest Bitcoin halving is just noise. It doesn't matter. Does it, like, if we get single side staking for PulseX, that's probably a bullish catalyst. You know, maybe our noise looks a little bit better, or maybe we don't get, you know, a lot of these improvements where we're looking forward to see, and maybe, you know, this noise looks a bit worse short term. But ultimately, this is all just noise. This entire period before the Bitcoin halving, I throw out the window. It doesn't even matter. It's not even relevant. It's only relevant for looking for good dollar cost averaging opportunities. But in my opinion, nothing before the latest Bitcoin halving matters at all. Does that answer your question?
Hashtag retirement May 2024. Or 2025 or 2026. Yeah, I know. That's super interesting.
I like Regan's comment saying Brandon is smarter than he looks. Thank you. I think